Chapter 12, Life Histories. Life histories provide information for resource managers about animals and their reproduction, how long it takes for the young to develop, how many eggs they produce, the age at which animals mature and start reproducing, and what some of their environmental requirements are. All of this information comes together when a resource manager is trying to understand an ecosystem and trying to figure out how they can go about fixing some of the damage that we've done to that ecosystem. It's through understanding life histories that resource managers can develop strategies for the particular way a river flows, or the way forests are managed in terms of clear cutting or leaving certain species behind to effectively allow the forest to be replaced in a short amount of time. As you get into this chapter, you'll see that it's broken up into three main sections. The first section deals with numbers versus size of offspring. So I'll be talking about animals and plants in this section, and then the second section deals with the trade-off between allocation of resources for reproduction and general survival for various types of animals. And then in the third section, I'll talk about some basic classification of life histories. Animals can be classified as R-selected or K-selected, and then we'll talk about a new model that's been developed in order to classify organisms based on their approach to reproduction. In the first section of this chapter, then, talking about the number versus size of offspring, we go back to our principle of allocation that basically says if an organism devotes its energy for a particular function, then it doesn't have as much energy for another function, such as growth versus reproduction, because overall energy is limited. So this leads to trade-offs between the number of offspring that are produced and the size of offspring that are produced. So in order to look at this, we'll go to a study that was done on darters. Darters are cute little fish that occur in many of the streams in the Midwest and in really different places all around the world. They're typically associated with clear, cool, fresh waters, and they tend to live near the bottom of the stream, and during breeding times the males take on beautiful colors, especially the rainbow darter. In this study, Turner and Trexler looked at the populations of different species of darters in similar streams and found that there was a group that had small eggs and another group that had larger eggs. And when they looked at the allelic frequencies of these different groups, they found that there was greater similarity between the allelic frequencies in those species that produced the smaller eggs. Now, the allelic frequencies are those alleles that occur at certain loci on the genome, and those that have more similar alleles are more closely related. And it's a measure of really gene flow within the population or between the populations. So greater gene flow would indicate greater distribution of the species. So those darters with the larger eggs, which hatched earlier and the young would start feeding earlier, those larvae didn't get carried down the stream quite as quickly. So those species ended up with greater genetic isolation than others. So here resource managers would be using this information in order to effectively preserve these species that had the greater differentiation by understanding the types of habitat that they need. For grassland managers, understanding seed production and seed size and type is also very important. When we look at grasslands, we see that this is an environment that's often highly disturbed, and these plants reproduce by producing huge numbers of seeds that are generally cast out by the wind and distributed across the land, and just a few of them survive. On the other hand, in wooded areas, the trees and those vines that climb on the trees produce large seeds and much fewer of them because the environment that they drop into is a much more stable environment. And so it's often shaded, and the new plants need lots of nutrients in order to get started. And once they've been established, they don't really have an opportunity to take over an area unless a large adult plant falls over or dies, and then all of a sudden there'll be an opportunity for a new one to take off. Westboy et al.'s research pointed this out and is used as a basis for management strategies and just for understanding the ecology of these different systems. Westboy et al. Also categorized the different types of seed dispersal, and this really points out the interconnectedness that we see in an ecosystem where the plants are dependent on the animals in some cases for distributing their seeds, and in turn the animals are dependent on the plants in that they use their seeds for food. So an understanding of these different interconnections allows the resource managers to preserve the essential components in an ecosystem that's under attack by, say, development in an uncontrolled manner. Other studies that were done by Jacobson and Erickson, as well as studies done by Siwa and Kikuzana, showed the importance of seed size in terms of the development of seedlings, and how the larger seeds gives those seedlings the opportunity to survive through some difficult environmental conditions and penetrating a thick layer of leaf litter in the forest, for example. And so again, this understanding allows the forest managers to more effectively deal with changing conditions. Studies by Shine and Sharnoff looked at the energy budgets in vertebrates, and they found this allocation of resources occurring here, where before animals reach sexual maturity, they're dumping all of their energy into maintenance and growth, and then after sexual maturity, they have to add in a component for reproduction, and so they're trading off between maintenance and growth or reproduction. So if they delay reaching sexual maturity until they're a larger size, then they can devote more of their energy to increase reproductive rate. Gunderson in his studies found a good relationship between the death rate or mortality rate of adult fishes or adult animals in general and the reproductive rate or the age at which they reach reproduction. So if there's higher mortality in the adults, those of reproductive age, then they tend to become sexually mature at an earlier age. This theory was supported by findings of Birchie and Fox, who did work on the pumpkin seed sunfish, which is a very common sunfish in our area. And they found that the higher, when there was higher mortality of the adults, then the younger fish reached sexual maturity. And the way we see this in many lakes is with what we call stunting of bluegills and pumpkin seeds because of the high mortality of the adults. So if we think about the life history information that we've talked about so far, and we relate that back to what we learned about population growth in the last chapter, we can classify, as MacArthur and Wilson did, animals and even plants into a couple of major groups, the R-selected and the K-selected species. So R is the maximum rate of reproduction, and so they're just using that as a way of designating those plants and animals that have a very high population growth rate. And those plants and animals often also have a high die-off rate after the population increases dramatically. Whereas the K-selected species are those that have a moderate growth rate that levels off at a carrying capacity and sustains at that level. Now, Pianka showed that most species actually are somewhere in between these two extremes, and there's really a continuum of R-selected to K-selected species. Table 12.1 in your textbook gives you a good listing of the characteristics that are favored by R selection versus K selection, and from this you can get an idea of what these two different classifications of species are. Let's turn now to plant life histories and look at a classification of plant life history strategies that was developed by Grime. He started out by identifying the two most important variables that exert selective pressure on plants, and those were intensity of disturbance and intensity of stress. And by disturbance, he's talking about anything that rips out the plants or destroys them, like a fire or a flood or maybe a hurricane or plowing the land. And by stress, he's talking about those things like lack of water or extensive heat or maybe a salty environment that cause the plants to have a difficult time growing. From these two variables, Grime developed these 4 environmental extreme conditions where you have, in the first one, low disturbance and low stress. This would be kind of like a forest environment where the area is very stable and there's plenty of light and it's not too hot and plenty of water. The low disturbance, high stress situation would be, say, a desert area where the plants aren't disturbed much, but they certainly have a difficult time getting water and they have to withstand a great amount of heat. The high disturbance, low stress environment would be kind of like a grassland area where there are frequent fires that come through and destroy the plants, but the soil is good and there's plenty of water. And then the last one you can envision as a beach environment where the plants are constantly disturbed by high wave action and they don't have a lot of nutrients in the soil because it's mainly sand. This then led Grime to categorize plants into three major types. The ruderalis, which are basically weeds that can grow about anywhere, um, at, especially in highly disturbed habitats, because they produce lots of seeds and they grow very, very quickly. So you can see these in a vacant lot, growing up and taking over right away. The stress tolerant species are things like trees that have the ability to conserve resources, but they grow rather slowly. And then the competitive plants uh, would be plants like our invasive buckthorn, which is a large shrub that outcompetes our native shrubs and to some extent some of our small trees. It grows very, very well and pushes out other plants. Figure 1220, I think, is a good figure because it really brings all of these concepts together with regard to the life histories of plants. And this is Grimes' classification of plant life history strategies. And you can see that there's a continuum between the different extremes that lead to competitive, ruderal, or stress-tolerant type plants. And you'll find plants all along each of those continua along the way. And this diagram really summarizes those concepts that we've been talking about. Weinmiller and Rose proposed an alternative strategy to those that we've been talking about. And they talk about opportunistic life history strategies and equilibrium and periodic. And here what they're doing is basically, if you look at figure 12.21 in your book, they talk about bringing together the ideas of fecundity, or the reproductive rate, the number of eggs in an individual, and compare that to the age of reproduction, their reproductive maturity, the alpha, and juvenile survivorship, the LX. In comparing those, then they put species on the continuum in this three-dimensional space, and it allows just another method of characterizing the life history strategies that animals, and I suppose you could put plants into this category as well. The last approach to classifying life histories that we have described in our text was developed by Charnoff, and this is an approach to this which provides what they call a life history cube. And by looking at figure 12.24, you can get an idea of how this works. It takes the relative reproductive effort over the whole adult lifespan and compares that to the relative offspring size and the reproduction over the lifespan, and removes the dimensions associated with that, and then you can see these animals arranged in different places in this life history cube. This particular approach hasn't been used very much in terms of resource management, at least that I'm aware of. So then, to briefly review this chapter, we looked at the offspring number versus the size in terms of seed size for plants and the number of eggs being produced by animals. And then we looked at how energy is allocated to adult survival versus reproduction. And then finally we saw different types of life history classification. And here we focused on the R-selected versus K-selected model and talked quite a bit about that, and also mentioned some of the new models that have been developed in order to classify life histories, particularly the model that we talked about with regard to rudderals and stress tolerant and competitive species in plants.